We're really excited today to talk to a CRO who's been at multiple startups and grown multiple startups from small amounts of revenue to hundreds of millions of revenue. So Tim Bertrand, we originally got to know each other when he was leading sales at Acquia. It's the company behind the open source project Drupal. He grew revenue there from 2 million to over 200 million. He went on to Project 44, which is now the market leader in supply chain logistics. And now Tim is the president at HAProxy, one of the world's fastest and most widely used load balancers. So Tim, would love if you could give an introduction to our audience. And as part of that introduction, there's a narrative that if someone has been a CRO and scaled a company, they probably wouldn't want to do it again. But you've done it once, twice, now you're doing it a third time. So maybe you can share with the audience why you joined these companies and what made you go from a large org going back to a company that's just starting to scale.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast today, first of all. So as I mentioned, came back late from a business trip last night. I still get out in the field a lot. It's one of my favorite things to do, and we'll talk about that a bit during some of the questions that you guys have for me today. But I'm really a builder, and I really enjoy watching a startup go from those kind of early stages of growth through scale. And I saw it at Acquia. I started off at Acquia sharing an office with the CEO, working off of milk crates. We were 20 people. We were making our first hires. We were trying to figure out the go-to-market. We were trying to figure out the product market fit. And then it was really fascinating to see that company scale. It taught me a lot. I tell people that I never went and got an MBA because all my jobs have really given me a real life MBA experience. And I got to see that at Acquia. Then after 10 years at Acquia, I went to Project 44, and that was a fantastic opportunity as well for me to really understand what a vertical SaaS company looks like. So Project 44 focused on the supply chain and inventory visibility space. It was just a completely different way to use my brain. I had been in infrastructure software for my whole career before that. And throughout this whole time, for about 8 years, I had been helping out the founder at HAProxy. So he had started the kind of commercial entity, HAProxy Technologies, about a decade ago or so. And he was beginning to scale that company. And it was really my way of giving back to the startup community to go back and help a founder like that. And that company I watched over the last few years and made the decision to join full time as president in the spring of this year because they were really hitting that same inflection point when I really enjoy joining companies. It's that kind of $15 million revenue range. All of the things are starting to come together to where you can start to see that the company's got some legs and it'll start to scale. So that's what I've done. I joined HAProxy back in the spring, and it's been nothing short of amazing so far. We've got an incredible product and an incredible team, and we're having an absolutely fantastic year. And the company really checked all the boxes that I would want to check for what a modern day startup should look like today. It's highly profitable, which is great. In our case, we don't have any venture capital investment, so it's been all bootstrapped by the founder, and the company grows over 40% a year. So it's just a fantastic place to be. I think if you were to talk to any leaders these days, they say, oh, that's the kind of company that I'm looking for. Profitable, growing quickly, excellent product, really, really unbelievable customer satisfaction, and a fantastic team. The people here are just absolutely world-class. And it's been a great, great move for me.
Amazing. I'm sure many founders listening wish they could find somebody like you who'd be willing to keep kind of going back into the early days in the trenches again. Now, look, conventional wisdom is that a founder must create a sales playbook before they bring on the go-to-market hires. What would be your advice to founders about this? Like, is it necessary? And when should they be bringing on their first go-to-market hires?
I think the answer is it depends. Some founders come from a sales background, right? So they have a bit of a leg up in that they've been in the field and they come through the sales background. Other founders are highly technical, right? And they have a highly technical co-founder as an example, and they really don't know what a go-to-market playbook looks like. And although they're involved in the early days of selling the product, I would say the answer is it depends. Some advice that I give a lot of founders is I wouldn't go too senior too quickly, right? So I've talked to founders and they ask me, the $2 million company, they say, hey, we're thinking about hiring a CRO. And I said, that would be a terrible decision, right? So a CRO is a role for scale, right? They understand process. They understand how to scale teams, hiring processes. They bring in the right systems. They understand that element of the business at a very, very granular level. A lot of times what companies need when they're $1 million or 2 million or 3 million or even 5 million or 8 million in revenue is they need feet on the ground that really understand the early days of how to go after a market, how to understand product market fit, how to evolve very, very quickly the messaging for the company out in the field. And I would give a lot of founders advice, make that first sales hire, someone that you could see evolve into a sales manager or director of sales. They're super excited to get in and help you as the founder get out there and make those first sales. I oftentimes give advice as well that sometimes in the early days, you can't measure revenue as much as you can traction. So landing pilots, landing strategic logos, getting that kind of early wins for the company is oftentimes much more important than the actual revenue traction. So, those are some pieces of advice that I've given to founders. I think I've seen companies just hire way too senior too early in their life cycle. And then the person comes in and they need sales engineers and they need more salespeople and they want a sales ops person. And they want to build a big infrastructure for a company that doesn't really need a big infrastructure. I'd say the one thing that's unique about myself is I still get out there and do a lot of the doing. At HAProxy, everything except for R&D and HR are kind of under my teams. But yet I was out in the field this week selling with the team. So I think that you still have to, in early stage companies, no matter what your role is, you have to be willing to get out there and put your feet on the ground and actually do the work.
Attitude, I guess, being a really important to there. So I think that's really great guidance. And we definitely see founders sort of fall down by trying to hire too senior too quickly. So if you take it as you're looking for that more junior, the sales sort of field rep who can actually grow into the role, how do you actually structure the hiring process, trying to find somebody like that? And what are some of the questions you'd be asking them as part of that interview process?
So that's a great question. First of all, I probably wouldn't hire someone that had been at large structured organizations their whole career. As much as they might say they want to get into a really gritty startup, I would say that you got to be very, very careful to make sure that you don't put yourself in a position where you hire someone that hasn't been through a journey like this before. I believe that there are, in many cases and in many roles, people that are right for certain stages of a company, right? I'll even admit, I'm a person where, you get to that 150, 200 million revenue range, and then it's a lot of process and it's a lot of things that I don't enjoy as much as I do the building phase. I'll be fine to be hopefully the third time in a row, someone that comes in and runs all of go-to-market that goes from 10 million to 150 million. I think I'd probably be in rarefied air to be through that journey 3 times in a row. But I think that there's also roles in companies where people are good fits for certain point in a company journey. And I think that when you're looking for those first sales hires, you need someone that's been through that experience before. They're not going to get frustrated that this week, this month, this quarter, we didn't close much, but we're gaining traction in other areas. So I think that's some advice that I give is make sure that you hire someone that's been through that journey before, that understands the process of obtaining product market fit, that understands you have to go in and land small and then expand in accounts and things of that nature. In terms of the actual hiring process for an earlier stage company, I think it's really important to make sure that you're hiring someone that fits with the team. In an early stage build, you're going to be spending a lot of hours with your colleagues, many nights, weekends, lots of weekends building the company. And you have to make sure that you hire someone that fits in that environment, that's dedicated to that environment, and understands that they're in for this build phase. Those are some really important elements I think that founders need to understand when they're making those first sales hires.
And you listed a couple things that great sales hires have at early stage companies. They need to be comfortable with ambiguity. Maybe they're not hitting quota metrics, but they're hitting these pipeline and pilot metrics. But when you're hiring, and hiring is both art and science, are there common traits that you've seen for the best hires you've made or common traits for the mishires you've made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to use the words moxie and grit. The best hires that I've made at the early stage companies are real hustlers, right? They don't even necessarily have domain experience, but they're really willing to do whatever it takes to help the company get to the next level, right? They understand the product really well. They help develop the messaging on the fly while they're in the field, right? We've got a working committee at HAProxy building our next generation sales presentation, and it's all the sellers involved, right? They're very passionate about making sure that we're changing the messaging as the company is evolving. So really having the grit to, to go through those early days and help the company make those early decisions are something that I think is really important. In terms of mishires, a lot of times it's just the wrong fit. I like to, think about it like this. If you're coming from a MarTech SaaS company, single product, you literally just turn the product on, limited configuration, and you start using the product. That's a much, much different sale than selling infrastructure platform that has to be implemented, that's highly complicated, that takes a system integrator or professional services to implement, and so on. And the seller that's been in those roles, selling that kind of point, click, turn it on, configure and go software, I found 95% of the time those folks fail when you put them in a solution-oriented, complex implementation, professional services. They just get really frustrated, or they just don't understand how to work with customers in that kind of an environment. They end up just, typically either quitting or they end up becoming very disgruntled because they come from such a different world. The other thing is hiring, I've mentioned this earlier, hiring someone that's only been at big, highly structured organizations into a really small company. I think oftentimes they get frustrated because small companies, you have to wear many hats and there's not 5 other people to do the 5 other jobs. You just have to do those jobs yourself. I remember when I joined my first startup, it was an Irish-based company. And one of the guys that was in the Boston office with me, there was 3 of us. He said, "Hey, this is the kind of job where if we need pens for the office, you get in the car and drive down the street and go to CVS and buy some pens. And, if we run out of coffee for the Keurig machine, like you go to the grocery store and buy some K-Cups for the Keurig machine." I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, right? Like there's just certain people that either they're done with that point in their career or they don't like that, or they've never worked at companies where they've had to do that before.
Yeah, the people who are great at a resource-rich organization may not flourish in a resource-constrained organization where there's just more work to do than there is people to do it.
Yeah.
You alluded to this about domain expertise. So you've built these world-class teams in distinct industries. When you're interviewing candidates, does domain experience matter?
I think in rare cases it does, but I don't really think that it matters generally. I like to use myself as an example. When I was 26, I built a $11 million federal government business in 2 years, and I had 0 domain experience. Our head of our federal sales business in DC has no federal experience, but I just had the will to succeed and I just figured it out, right? Like I learned the acronyms. I would go down to DC 4 days a week and I would have a breakfast meeting, a coffee meeting, a lunch meeting, an afternoon office meeting, and a dinner meeting. And I would do that 4 days a week, every single week until we succeeded down there. I would meet partners. I would meet anybody that would talk to us about what we did. And I did a lot of unorthodox things that helped us grow a lot faster than a traditional federal business. We hired folks at Project 44 that had just infrastructure experience. They came from places like Acquia. In the past, they didn't have supply chain experience. They're some of the best sellers that the company had. I've taken people out of recruiting jobs in a company that, if you think about it, recruiting is really a sales job, but they weren't enterprise sellers. They were some of the best enterprise sellers in the business. So I think it's much, much more about all the things that we know that help you succeed in life: work ethic, understanding the product, getting really, really deep into the product and the messaging, committing yourself to success based upon what industry you're in, really understanding the industry and the trends in the industry and so on. I think those things are a lot more important than people that either have domain experience or come with a Rolodex. I do think that there are certain roles, like a biz dev role or an advisory role for a very specific vertical, and you've got lots of folks that and you've been in that vertical for 25 or 30 years or what have you. I think that can add value for companies at a certain stage, but I would not over-index on domain experience. Is something that I think I've made that mistake on earlier in my career, and I don't necessarily think that it's one of the top things I look for.
I think that's really great guidance. I definitely see a lot of times founders want the person who's built in that sector to come and sort of rinse and repeat what they've done there with them. And, what I often wonder is, well, what's in it for the, go-to-market leader or the individual joining, right? And there's the opportunity for the learning when you've got the new sector and experience, and people often do want to have that new domain expertise to add to their bow. So I can totally see the validity there. So, okay, we've talked through the attitudinal things we need, the type of characters that we're looking for. So say you found this salesperson that's going to join you on your mission. What do you think are the best practices for onboarding sales reps? And again, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen when it comes to onboarding and where people haven't ended up working out?
Yeah, I think the three most important things for onboarding a sales rep are, number one, really understanding the product at a super granular level. I've always been a person where if I feel like I'm the dumbest person in the room because I don't understand the product, I know I really have to do my homework, and I want my reps to feel the same way. It's really embracing and understanding the product at a very, very fundamental level. I think that's super, super important. The second thing is really understanding and embracing the messaging and value proposition. I'm a big medic and force management disciple, and I really think that their whole command of the message training is incredibly important. You want everybody in your sales org, and really everybody in the company, to be able to talk about what you do, how you do it differently, and the proof points that you have with other customers. You want that to be a very, very consistent message across your team. So I think that's really important as well. And then the third thing is mirroring the best sales reps who also follow the best sales process, right? We know we have a few maverick reps in a large org that just get their deals done, and they never use Salesforce, and they never update their records and so on. But then, that's not a best practice, right? You want your new reps mirroring the reps that follow best practices, that follow the sales process, that do a great job understanding the messaging and so on. And I found this kind of a buddy system or mentorship system with your best senior reps, and taking the deals and deconstructing the ideal deals for the company and then teaching that to the new reps. Those are really, I think, the three most important things you have to nail when you're onboarding a rep.
I love this idea of the buddy system, that if somebody joins a team and doesn't succeed, the team can look at themselves internally and say, shoot, maybe part of it's our fault because we didn't set them up for success. So it really puts an individual's success back on the entire team. So let's talk about some tactical sales execution tips. So you mentioned medic, force management. Some technical founders may not even know what those acronyms or frameworks mean. So just starting with the very basics of that, great salespeople ask great questions.
Yeah.
What does a great discovery and qualification process look like?
In the end of the day, we're all trying to, as sellers, determine a very common set of attributes about a customer and about a deal. First, we're trying to understand, do they have some pain that we can help them with? The second thing is, are we talking to a qualified buyer? Do they have some interest? Do they have a project on the horizon where we believe we could be a fit? There's a lot of tire kickers. They're just downloading things off your website, and they have no propensity to buy. They have no ability to buy. They have no time frame. They have no budget, things of that nature. So those are some of the basics that we're looking for. The second thing is understanding kind of where they are today and where they want to go, using, again, the force management nomenclature. It's about being able to paint a picture of, here's where you are today. Here's some of the things that you're frustrated with or that you have pains with. It could be cost. It could be efficiency. It could be technical capabilities that you don't have or what have you. And then in an ideal world, here's where you want to go, right? And then it's the seller's job to then map what are the required capabilities or requirements to get you from where you are to where you want to be, right? And then as the sale starts to evolve, it's making sure you also understand, for example, am I talking with someone who's a coach? Am I talking with someone who could be a champion for us? They're willing to run this up the flagpole to their executives. Who is the executive buyer? I find that 99% of the time when deals push, get delayed, or deals don't happen, it's because the team is not talking to the economic buyer early enough in the process. The team is afraid of talking to the economic buyer. They're talking to a coach. They're not even talking to a champion that can run something up the flagpole for them, right? They take deals really, really deep into the sales cycle without ever talking to the economic buyer. I, for example, got an email from an investor that I know who apparently has a portfolio company who's trying to sell something to HAProxy, and the person that they've been working with now for months at HAProxy is an influencer, but not an economic buyer. In this particular case, like I wouldn't even be the final approval for what these folks are trying to sell us. So like the fact that it's now they've been selling to us and I learn about this 6 months later, I don't even know about it, right? Certainly our founder doesn't know about it either. These are really, really big mistakes that sellers make, like not getting to that economic buyer fast enough. There's a lot of ways that you can do it as well. That's actually what a lot of what I do in the sales process is I help what we do call the team level up in the sales process. If I'm coming to the meeting that we need to make sure that we have access to the economic buyer, I build a separate relationship with the economic buyer. And this is a really, really important element in the sales process. So I think, those are some of the key fundamental attributes of discovery that you have to do when you're kind of figuring out, do we have a real deal here? And are we talking to the right people? And do we solve a pain that is big enough for them to spend substantial money on our platform?
Is it as simple as just asking? Like, how do we find out who that economic buyer is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it is just as simple as asking, right? I like to ask it in a very tactful way. If we were to do a deal together, can you just walk me through everything that has to happen between now and when the deal would close? Like who would need to be involved? How long does it take? What does the procurement or paperwork process look like? And you just rattle off a bunch of these questions. And if you build a good enough relationship internally, the person will typically just talk for 20 minutes. Oh, this person's got to be involved. And then we have to go to a committee and then there's going to be red lines. And by the way, every one of them takes 4 months to get done here and get through legal. And then as a seller, you can say, oh, wow, like this deal is not going to happen for the next 5 months, right? I see sellers forecasting deals in quarter. They haven't asked these questions and they find out it takes 4 months to get a deal through red lines. So I think sometimes it just really is as simple as figuring out the right and tactful way to just ask those hard questions. Sellers oftentimes are afraid of asking those questions, or they'll ask it too bluntly, like, are you the person that signs the deal? It's just, why not just ask, hey, what are all the things that would have to happen? Who else needs to be involved in order to get a deal done? What have you seen in your last 5, 10, whatever years at the company in order to get deals done? I think it's just as simple as that.
Really valid advice. So I guess beyond just asking those, let's say probing rather than just sort of blunt questions, are there any other tactics that a salesperson can use to create urgency in the sales cycle?
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that there's some type of compelling event. If there's no compelling, and by the way, price is never a compelling event. A discount, a price, that's never a compelling event. That's just a great way to give away value. I've learned it even more here at HAProxy, where we don't work in quarters, right? The founder doesn't really care about quarters, cares about annual growth year over year. But, he said to me one time, like giving a 10% discount to get a deal done on a Friday when we know it's going to happen in 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks or even 8 weeks from now, that's crazy. Like, why are we giving away 10% of the value? There's no pressure coming from anybody to get the deal done by a certain date. And I think I see a lot of reps just try to lob discounts out there in order to get deals done. You can fix this with great compensation systems, right? You can even tell a rep, hey, we know it's the end of the year, but if we're going to get 10% more to get the deal done in January, then I'll just figure something out with your own compensation in order to do that, right? There's ways to fix this that any CEO, any board, any investor would be totally fine with, because we're generating more value in a very, very short incremental period of time. So I think that's really important, but making sure that there's some type of compelling event. They have a launch coming up. They have use it or lose it funding at the end of the year. That means the deal has to get done or the budget goes away. They have some pain that's costing them a lot of money. And if they don't solve that pain, it'll continue costing them money every day, every week, every month. These are compelling reasons for an organization to buy. Those are very compelling reasons. Well, if they don't buy it today, the price is going to go up 5%. Isn't that compelling?
Really interesting. And then thinking about how things have changed over the years, because obviously, look, we're in a different era now to when you would have started out. So how have you found that building pipeline, for example, has evolved? Like, is cold calling and cold outbounding dead? Definitely doesn't feel it to me, but how do you perceive that and how has it changed?
I think some things have changed. I think it's the access to data is way easier now. A lot of what's going on in a call, I didn't even call them like chat companies, that they're really more engagement companies, right? So we implemented Qualified at HAProxy, and they have a AI SDR chatbot that is literally amazing. I mean, unbelievable. You can say, I'd like to see if you have a webinar on this topic. And it'll go like, yes, we do. Here it is. Here's the link. You can say, I'd like to know, do you have documentation that tells me how to do X and Y and Z, and actually point you to the actual link to the documentation right to the point where the person needs to go. So I think some of these things have made it easier for buyers to come to your digital property and self-service and then raise their hand when they're ready to move forward. I think access to contact information, email address, cell phone numbers. We use things like Zoom Info, right? You can get just about anybody's cell phone number in the world using Zoom Info or another product like that. I think access to data is way easier than it was when I was a BDR back in my early days. I don't think that just making 50 to 100 cold calls a day and just blasting out emails with no context and no research and so on, I think that's kind of a waste of time. But I will say, like, doing very, very thoughtful research, sending thoughtful LinkedIn messages, following people on LinkedIn, commenting, liking their posts, following them on Twitter, commenting, engaging with them on these social channels, having marketing, incorporating things like account-based marketing and account-based marketing platforms, so that by the time you get to a buyer, they kind of already know who you are, right? Like if I follow you on LinkedIn, I start liking your posts, I comment on your posts, I know what company you're from. When you go to LinkedIn, you start seeing my company. When you go around the web, you start seeing my company, right? And then maybe we still even use direct mail sometimes. We FedEx, really well-researched letters that we know with a FedEx next day is going to get on an executive's desk, right? They're very, very likely to open that. Doing all of these things at the same time, it's kind of a surround tactic for getting into an account. We also use advisors, right? We hire advisors that have come from industry that have connections, right? So now the advisor goes to an executive at that company and they go, yeah, I've heard of this company before. So using these surround tactics, I think my opinion is they've been around forever. Some of the tooling's changed. It's more advanced. There's AI now, there's advances in this market, but I think still just doing the hard work, that part of it hasn't changed. I still think it works. Yesterday, like I said, we were at a conference and just spent a lot of times walking around, introducing ourselves to people, telling some stories about people just like them that we work with, and probably walk out of there with 4 or 5 highly qualified CIO meetings from the conference. So to me, that stuff just doesn't change. That's just part of the business. And I think it's worked forever, and you just have to get out there and do the hard work.
I love this idea of surround tactics and that it really becomes a team sport rather than just one BDR launching 100 cold calls.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about deal review. So when a founder hires their first couple salespeople and they ask the salespeople, hey, why'd we lose the deal? The salespeople may just say, oh, they're not interested. When you're running a deal review, what's a good reason and a bad reason to lose a deal? Who else is part of the deal review? Walk us through what that looks like.
Yeah. So first of all, I think deal reviews are super important. The deal review shouldn't be a place or an environment where the rep feels like, I'm just doing this so that Tim understands what's going on, or Dylan, who's our head of sales, understands what's going on. The deal review is the map, right? It's like you don't drive from here to Florida without GPS or a map. You could, you'd probably get there eventually, but you probably make a lot of wrong turns, might take a lot longer to get there, and so on. The deal review is really the map for how you get the deal done. It's, when you think about things like BANT or MEDIC or whatever qualification methodology that you use, when you have these in your deal review process and in your template, and you do active coaching and deal reviews with reps, it's where you begin to uncover, we don't have access to the economic buyer. There's not a compelling event. We don't have a champion or coach. We don't understand the success metrics for the customer. This is why deal reviews are important. It's where you implement that qualification criteria. It's where you as a leader can uncover where the holes are in the deal. And I think that's how you do deal reviews and why they're so important. And then once you land an account, then it goes from deal review to account planning, right? It's like, okay, how do we move from land to expand in the account? What are the other opportunities? How well networked are we in the account? Who else do we have to meet? How do we expand our footprint inside of the account? These are just strategic maps if you will, for getting deals done and expanding deals over time.
Yeah, this is when sales is art and science. This is really the science behind it and putting down some real objective plans and data behind it. Something that's really challenging for early stage startups is figuring out pricing. When you're in a large organization and pricing has guardrails and there's a deal desk to approve commercial terms, that's much different than when you're small and trying to figure out pricing and how much you can actually charge for a product. So what would be your advice to founders and early stage sales team that are trying to figure out pricing? Is it all value based? What should they be doing to figure out what they can charge?
I think it depends. I think if you're in a well-established market and you understand, first of all, you have to really deeply understand your competitive landscape. How do your competitors license their solutions? If you're in a CPU-based market and everybody's licensing by CPU and you say, oh, we're going to license by whatever, by department or by platform type or what have you, that's going to be hard, right? Because you're trying to change a market that's used to buying a certain way, right? It can be done, but it's going to be hard. And then you have to understand what value are we providing, what features are we providing, how are we packaging us all of this to be able to defend our, in this case, CPU pricing against our competitors. When you're in a market that's a little bit less established and you're solving a big business problem, then I think you can start to really play around with value-based pricing or platform plus, module-based pricing and things of that nature. So I think that it depends on how well established the market is. It depends upon patterns and trends that have occurred in the market. I do think value, some element of value pricing is important for every company, but I really just think it depends upon, how well entrenched the market is that you're going into, the competitors are, how they license, and so on.
We really want to drill down more into kind of cross-functional collaboration because we know how important that is. But before, I want to focus a bit more on the sales team in particular, and specifically the culture within that team. Like, what does good culture in a sales team look like?
Yeah.
And how are those people, best incentivized?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question and a great question. I think the culture, people use that word, every other sentence these days. Well, the person needs to be a culture fit. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like, if the team is a bunch of ex-football players that go out and drink beer every day after work, is culture fit someone that looks like that? Like, I don't think that's culture fit. Cultural fit is someone that really embodies the values of the company, the values of the entire company, right? So that's not just the sales team, but the engineering team, the founders. There's a lot of elements that you need to understand about the company and then determine, would this person fit in this culture, right? So, I'll use HAProxy. We're a remote work environment. We have very few offices, right? In the US, we have no offices, right? So someone that's okay working in a remote environment using all remote tools and so on, and we've got this company wired extremely well for remote work, but it takes a certain individual to be able to fit into that environment, right? So being a good cultural fit in that environment means they have to be a self-starter, means they have to be okay working remotely and not going into offices, not seeing their colleagues an awful lot or what have you. So I think the answer is it depends, and culture is defined company by company. And as you evaluate employees coming into that environment, you have to evaluate them against the culture in its entirety, right? Like, we're a very engineering centric culture because it's a highly technical product, right? So that influences the kind of pre-sales people we hire, the kind of sales people we hire, the kind of marketing folks that we hire, and so on. So I think all of these things are really important. And then you layer on top of that, what are the values of the company, the values of the founder, and how does this person appear to fit inside of that? And then the last thing is, I think we always like to think about how diverse can we make the company as well, right? So like how do we focus on making sure that we don't have a cookie cutter environment where every person looks and thinks the same, right? How do we embrace a culture of bringing in new thoughts, diverse backgrounds, and so on, so that we can just build a great company? And those to me are the things that I think about when I think about culture and cultural fit.
Yeah, that makes sense. That culture is a widely used word, but poorly understood in most cases. Culturally, sales teams have to engage with the rest of the organization. And One simple framework for startups that are in a failure mode is that you either got a product problem or a sales problem. Sales
Yeah.
will point at product and say, oh, the product's weak, it won't sell. Product says that sales doesn't know how to sell it. So how do you make sure that the customer-facing organization works well with product and that you have a unified team there?
Well, I think there has to be a constant feedback loop, especially in a small company. There has to be very, very clear and regular communication inside of the organization. And I think that in a highly technical sale, that starts with having really strong pre-sales folks in between the product org and the sales org, right? If you have pre-sales engineers that can relay customer requirements, what customers need, what's going on in the market, back to product, and they're constantly working with one another, that relieves a lot of friction between what sales believes they need to be selling and what product is actually delivering. So I think that that's one super important element, is to make sure that you have a really strong pre-sales team to bridge that gap between the product and engineering organization and the sales organization. And then the second thing is having regular cadence of communication. We have a bi-weekly meeting between the sales team and the product team so that we can say, hey, what's on your mind? Product has seen something that they think we need to adjust in the sales process, or the sales team seeing a repeated pattern of capabilities or requirements from customers. And that's our opportunity to make sure that we're all on the same page.
It really does all come down to comms, doesn't it? At the end of the day,
Yep.
and we can be so neglectful of the internal focus on comms when focusing out, externally so much of the time. Beyond having great comms, and I love this, this pre-sales team. I've not actually heard of that before, so that's been a real education for me. Thank you. What are some of the other strategies you've seen work well to kind of resolve conflicts between different departments? And how do you ensure all departments that aren't as, necessarily commercially driven are aligned with revenue goals?
Yeah, I think it does really come down to leadership in that case. I think when you have leaders that feel misaligned, or the team feels and sees that misalignment, and I've been really blessed to work at a bunch of companies where the leaders were all really aligned on the company's goals. And I think it really matters to how you compensate your top leaders. They all need to be compensated on similar corporate goals, whether that be growth, margin, retention rates, net retention. All of these things are really just extrapolated up from how well the product's working, how sticky the product is, what we're delivering on. Have we sold the right deals? Have we sold the right capabilities? And when you combine all these things and then you compensate and align compensation based upon these common goals, I think then it helps everybody row in the same direction. And then, as a founder, or in my role as president, it's really making sure that, my number one job in the company is to make sure that I'm recruiting the best people that are great fits with one another, that are all rowing in the same direction, that are all very goal focused and helping us meet our goals. That's really the goal of the top management in the company, to make sure that you're bringing the best team onto the field to solve these challenges for the company.
So, Tim, you've been at a couple open source companies, and open source is not really a business model. It's a way to build software and collaborate with others and distribute software. And so business models around open source can vary. There's hosting, professional services, open core, et cetera. And so when a founder is trying to build a business around an open source project, and they're in those early ideation phases, what's your biggest piece of advice to them on what to do, and then what mistakes to avoid around open source?
Again, like a lot of answers I've given today, it really depends. The open source licensing method is huge, for determining what the business model is going to look like for the company. Some open source founders choose a licensing methodology that doesn't, for example, allow you to redistribute an enterprise version of the product, as an example. So I think that that's obviously something that you have to know upfront before you can start thinking through the business model. It's super clear that open source is starting to eat the software world. If you look at some of the most successful publicly traded software companies, you see Snowflake and MongoDB and Confluent. That was why I was so excited to get back into open source. It's becoming the de facto decision point or choice. Like, why wouldn't we use open source for this versus using something proprietary? So I think that's been an interesting evolution over the last decade or so. And I think, again, it really depends upon, what the core licensing methodology is. Some, projects will allow you to distribute the core for free, but then you can sell module add-ons as an example. At Acquia, Drupal was completely free and could be used by anybody. We sold it in a hosted environment, and we built closed source proprietary plugins, personalization plugins, CDP, digital asset management, and so on, that were not open source. In this case, they were adjacent products. So I do think, though, that in the end of the day, in any open source model, you have to nurture the community, and you have to get ground up or bottoms up growth in enterprises by nurturing community users that are solving problems in enterprises to raise their hands and say, hey, I need something more than this. And a lot of that is done through great content and great education, right? The best open source companies in the world provide a community product that could be used by many organizations who might not need to upgrade to an enterprise product, but they do because we provide great education, great content, and the enterprise features that they need provide extreme amounts of value to the customer, right? So I think when you can combine those things, a highly valuable set of enterprise features that once you've gotten going with the community edition, then you say, wow, if I only had these 5 things, right, and those are available in the enterprise edition, you still get the benefit and the value of, the open source world, the speed of contribution, the speed of innovation, and so on, because it's still at the core of what you're doing, and then you're getting this extreme value on top of that with what the company's providing in its enterprise editions. And then you layer into that, how do we get people to raise their hands? It's about providing unbelievable content, educational content, documentation, and so on, that makes these enterprises raise their hand, allow you to contact them, give you their contact information, and so on. That's obviously how you start building a pipeline and getting engagement with enterprises.
I like this approach of education, content, and community engagement. I think one of the biggest mistakes an open source founder can do is hold the community hostage. And that certainly is the opposite of that. You mentioned a couple sales methodologies, MEDDIC, force management. Maybe technical founders have never heard of those. What are those? And if a founder is super early without any salespeople around them, what are these methodologies and how can they go about using them for founder selling?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, at its simplest, right, a founder needs to understand something like BANT, right? Budget, authority, need, time frame. Right? That's the simple. Like, if you think about any of these sales methodologies, MEDDIC layers in understanding the customer's metrics, understanding the economic buyers, the coaches, the champions, the compelling events, the decision time frame, and so on. BANT is the simplest: budget, authority, need, time frame. Right. So I think that at a minimum, founders should pick up a book like Spin Selling as an example. Right. They should just go online and research things like BANT, BANT. They should go online and research MEDDIC. There's a few different versions. There's one with 2 C's, one with 3 C's, right? So I think that there's some basics that a founder should understand, but they all get down to the same thing. Are we talking to the right person? Do they have budget? Is there a reasonable time frame? Do they have the authority to make purchases? What kind of metrics or decision points or outcomes are they looking to solve? This is really what it comes down to for founders, and making sure they understand or they engage in an opportunity where the customer has a propensity to buy.
Valid. And then, look, Tim, you talked earlier around, CROs and the right time to hire them, and it really just being a role that you need at scale. Say you are a scaling business and you are ready, you have the readiness for that CRO. What should you be looking for in this person?
Well, again, it depends. I think stage matters. There are CROs that are absolutely fantastic at 200 plus million of scale, right? They really understand how to build big international businesses. They understand all the structure and process and how to bring the best leaders on board regionally, globally, and so on. They implement new systems and new scaling systems and so on. That's a lot different than hiring a CRO for a company that wants to scale from 20 million to 80 million over 2 years, right? I think that there's folks that are really, really good at that hyper growth, take it from one level to the next, 20 to 80. And then there's folks that are really, really good at that 200 plus million CRO role, where it's really heavy structure, process, hiring, leadership and so on. So I really do think it depends upon the stage in which you're hiring for.
Makes a lot of sense. Tim, I feel we could carry on chatting to you for hours, but I'm incredibly conscious of time. And yeah, I mean, I've taken away so much from this conversation, from, learning how to hire and onboard sales teams, to really thinking about how can you expedite sales cycles and actually getting to the heart of determining, who that economic buyer is much earlier in the process by asking the right probing questions. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time with us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Thanks, Tim.